Great innovation stories make change possible. Each week on the Innovation Storytellers podcast, I invite innovation leaders to share how they overcame the obstacles to introduce breakthrough ideas to the world through the power of story. I'm featuring guests from Tesla, TD Ameritrade, Corning, Cisco, Bloomberg, and so many more. Listen in to learn how you can tell a more effective innovation story and change the future for the better. Hey everyone, I'm your host, Susan Lindner here at Innovation Storytellers. We are doing a very special edition today where it's just me telling you these ideas and sharing the mic with my colleague, Nikki Groom. We are going to be talking a little bit today about all things storytelling, just a back and forth casual conversation about what's happening in the world of innovation, in the world of COVID, and in the world of storytelling, and how we take those experiences 2 years into this pandemic and begin really reflecting on the stories that we'll be telling and what we've experienced over this last year. Nikki is my right-hand woman, managing all things marketing, but not to mention she is a published author in her own right. She is a business branding and marketing strategist extraordinaire. And so I want to introduce all of my listeners to Nikki Groom. Nikki, thank you for joining me.
I am so excited to be here, and I'm most excited about getting to pick your brain in a forum that other people can listen to, because so often I ask you questions and we're kind of creating content together. And when I get you on that soapbox, it's always worthwhile and you deliver so many golden nuggets. So I'm really excited to ask you those questions that I've been dying to ask you and share them with your audience.
Well, let's get to it, because there's so many amazing things that we've been talking about that we can do now just in a free-flowing conversation without our typically amazing guests.
Yes, and they are very amazing, it has to be said. Well, I guess let's start with the basics. Tell us a little bit about why innovation storytelling? Why does it matter? Why do you do this work?
Yeah, the greatest hardship for me is thinking about all the innovations that never made it to their finish line. The ones that were churning around in the corporate epicenter and never made it to prototype, to scale, or all the way to the market because an innovator was unable to express the incredible opportunity that that innovation was going to provide. And that opportunity might be money. It might be growing a new market. It might be bringing a new product to life, but maybe it was world changing. Maybe it was something that we couldn't have even seen. We couldn't have foreseen what the consequences of that incredible innovation could have been. And when you talk to innovators who have been in this space for a really long time, they always have a couple of regrets. The one that never got, that kind of like the one that got away. And many times it's because the CEO or the board or the head of engineering who was intended to scale that project couldn't see the vision, couldn't get there. And for me, that's fault of communication, not a fault of the innovation. And so I want to be able to build that bridge and share the communication science that actually gets innovations to their finish line. So that's why I do the work every day, is because I don't want to live in the regret of great innovation not getting to the place and to the people that it needs to get to.
Yes, I love that. And something you always say is that storytelling is one of the world's best time-saving devices. Tell us some more about that.
It is. So many people go, oh, I don't want to tell a story. I can't tell you at large companies where they just say, I want 3 bullets. I want 1 slide. Just give it to me straight. I got to go. I got lots of other things to do. And the reality is that story is a memory-making device. Story is a memory-making device. Every time you tell a story, the way the human brain is wired, this is how we are intended to receive information. So we know that the brilliant folks at Stanford have already done the research for us. We know that if you just drop those 3 bullets, if you just offer the statistics, or if you just do the 1 slide or the Excel spreadsheet, even worse, you are bound to forget that information within 6 minutes of leaving the meeting. 6 minutes of leaving the meeting. So imagine killing yourself on that spreadsheet, figuring out those bullets, putting together that PowerPoint presentation. And most PowerPoint presentations are not in story form, but they can be 50, 60, 70 slides long. How long did it take you to make that PowerPoint? Only to find out that you're either inundating with people with information, or you're giving them so little information without context that they've forgotten it 6 minutes later. Chief innovation officers, executives out there, do you want all that work for naught? So, what we do find, what Stanford tells us, is that when we wrap those bullet points in story, we are 22 times more likely to remember that information. 22 times. So, if you want a time saving device, then you don't have to keep repeating yourself, holding the same meeting over and over again, trying to get alignment around the same 3 bullets. Tell a story. And a story isn't War and Peace. It can be as short as 5 simple sentences. So this is why story is so important. It is an executive's greatest productivity tool, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
Yes. And of course, time is money. And I know that you've had some conversations behind the scenes that people have told you we could stand to save up to like $100 million because of innovation storytelling. Like, that's no joke.
Yeah. And it's amazing to me when a salesperson comes up to me and says that. And I said, why do you think that? And he said, we simply don't have the rapport with the customers where they treat us like a trusted expert or a consultant, as opposed to some kind of transactional sale. It's only when a salesperson is able to open up a little bit, share some of themselves, tell a little bit of the story about what's going on back at the office, and actually have empathetic listening for the customer, to really take a moment and learn about the customer, listen to the customer, put themselves in the customer's shoes, that the customer is willing to open their P&L, willing to open their budget and say, I know we really need you guys. I don't know where we're going to pull the money from. Can you help me? I know that we're doing this deal right now and it's going to take us through 2023, but I want to plan for 2028. Mr. Salesperson, can you help me? Can you help me plan and think about what I need? My capital expenditures, my learning and development budget, my growth and development plan, 3 years, 4 years down the road. That's the $100 million close that salesperson was talking to me about, because he can't get into the customer's vulnerable side to say, I know I need help. Could you help me? It's only when we start sharing those stories that the customer is willing to open themselves a little bit more and say, yes, I want to be a partner with you. I want to go down that road together with you. When you really think about it for a minute, if we take a step back from everything we know about working, strategy, right? Business strategy is a story until it's executed. So when you're revealing the 2023, the 2022 story, the strategy that you're sharing with the team, it's a story. It's a vision. It's nothing more than that, right? It's the collective imagination of the team that says we want to get from point A to point B. That's a story. How you tell that story determines how engaged your team will be on executing on it. And so if you can actually get a customer to go, I want to let you in. I want to tell you what my strategy is. And I want to walk down that path together with you. The price tag becomes irrelevant because you're helping your prospect get to the goal. And so those stories are those breadcrumbs along the way that you'll continue to tell that get you to goal. But until the execution starts, everything is still just a story. But getting people on board with that story is the requirement of every leader. It's not the nice to have. It's the absolute must have. You can write 1,000 playbooks. You can write 1,000 strategies. But if they're not compelling and engaging and get other people to start talking about how cool your strategy is, it's going nowhere. And it's especially true for innovation when you're creating something no one's ever heard of before.
And you brought up vulnerability. You said something to me earlier this week about the fact that vulnerability, it really builds resilience, agility, engagement, belonging. And it appears to me that vulnerability really is at the heart of storytelling. So there's the business case for innovation storytelling there as well. Tell us some more about that and some of your thoughts around that piece.
Well, when we talk about this previous idea about storytelling as productivity tool, of course we want our teams to be as productive as possible. We want to use stories like memory making devices, but not only that, when we tell a story that gets us hyped around a strategy, we bring alignment to a group of people who now say, I believe that story, I will follow that story. And I'm part of a team that believes that story. So that alignment is critical if we're going to get all of our troops moving in the same direction, right? Ask any drill sergeant. It's not about just getting to point Z. We actually need people to follow us of their own volition. So alignment is the key. The story is the engagement tool. The story is what says, I believe what you believe. I'm willing to go forward together with you. I'm engaged. I'm properly incentivized. I can see the path ahead of me and I'm moving. But what really makes a great story stick with a team is when the leader decides to be vulnerable. When the leader decides to share a story that says, I'm going to share a piece of me that no one else knows about me, or I'm going to share a piece of the difficulty that I've encountered in the past, and I want to let you in. And the minute that that leader lets his team or her team in is the moment that the rest of the team exhales and says, I now want to share a piece of me. And that connection is the glue that holds a team together. That's the point of engagement. But it does something else, right? When you create this two-way flow of information, when a leader says, I'm going to share a story that makes me vulnerable, we know a couple of things about human experience. Number one, we connect at the pain. We don't connect at the celebration. We're celebrating together because we've experienced, or we empathize at a minimum, with the pain that each of us has experienced. So that's where we connect. That's how humans are wired. We understand your challenge, you understand my challenge, we get each other, we move forward. So that connection allows us to go beyond what we talk about as inclusion, and we get to this place called belonging. When you share something challenging and I share something challenging, and we're able to tell that story collectively as a group, we now go beyond inclusion, feeling like I was the last person picked for the team, but I'm here, right? I was the last person hired. I now feel like I have a sense of belonging, which, for all the talk we have about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the next frontier of that is actually belonging. I want to feel like I was always meant to be here. I belong here. I belong with all these other folks. It's not just being included. That is a team that is now not just powerful, aligned, engaged, belong, but they are resilient. They are resilient because they don't fear sharing the tough stuff with one another. They can share it with one another. They can find the solution together. They can tell the story of that revelation, and they can resiliently move forward. So that method, right? Storytelling does so much more than just convey information. It actually creates a bond among people who hear it. Because a lot of people don't know is when I tell a story, your brain is actively looking for a similar story and a similar experience that's taking place in your brain, in your life. So I'm telling a story and your brain is flipping through the files going, where is that? I remember something like that. I remember failing my first driver's license test too. Oh, right. That was humiliating. All right. That was really hard. I was afraid to go home and tell my mom. I couldn't wait. I was terrified. I never wanted to drive again. All of those experiences then go, "Oh, I got it. Click. I remember that. Boom. I'm with you." So that's how the human brain works. And when we keep telling those stories, we keep the engagement going because those pathways combine. We click together. So when the story is told just right and it resonates, everyone is turned on like a string of Christmas lights. Boom. We all get lit up together. And that's how the belonging happens.
Yes. And it's funny because just as you were sharing that, I thought, yep, failed my first driving test. And I remember how awful that was. So amazing. And yeah, it strikes me that What better for an innovation culture or a culture that really prioritizes innovation than people who feel supported and valued and included and like they belong? It really does make a huge difference, I'm sure.
Yeah. So let's talk about innovation culture for a heartbeat,
Yeah.
because it's one thing to have innovation, right? And sometimes that's taking place in an innovation center, off campus, protected in a bubble away from the rest of the corporate quarterly results, brigade that kind of just go churns on and on and on. But innovation culture is a fascinating goo. I think that it's something that runs through the veins of companies that do it well. And when I think about what that innovation culture is, the reason why those cultures are so resilient, it is because they have a high tolerance for failure. So if we go back to that meeting where we're thinking about sharing a little bit about ourselves and creating this culture of belonging and inclusion, it naturally must include the ability to fail and still be held together by the team. That we have a tolerance for supporting each other's failure so that we can get to the good stuff, right? We know that great poker championships are won on folding. I think the number is 88% of the time. If you've ever gone to the World Series of Poker in Vegas, and I have spent 6 summers at the World Series of Poker, having represented 44 professional poker players in my lifetime, it is the most boring sport in the world to watch because the best fold over and over and over and over again. Now, you could say, well, that's not failure on their part, but it's not even taking the at bats, right? It's knowing which ones to play. And yet you can still lose it all, right? So, poker may not be the best analogy for what happens in an innovation culture, but do you actually have the tolerance to say, this isn't going to work? My great idea isn't going to work. Or one of the guests we had on board who was responsible for all the glass in the new Tesla prototype of their pickup truck. And Elon Musk's number two guy took a steel snowball to that window, threw it, and it broke. So he said, you know what? Let's do it one more time. Maybe you threw it too hard. And he threw it again, and it broke. Millions of people around the world watching the launch of this new pickup truck. And he came into work the next day. And I said, what did your colleagues say to you? And they go, nice glass. Shaky. And he goes, but I still have a job there because the only memo I got was fix it. No worries. And so what is it like to walk into your office the next day knowing that you had a worldwide viewing of your greatest failure? And for your boss to go, hey, can you fix that?
Yeah.
So that culture, when we connect at the tough part, right? When we connect at the hard stuff and we go, oh, I got you in the midst of the really big global failure, right? I got you is a way that innovation can keep on going because he's now going to go forward and make the best possible glass, right? What we didn't say is that Elon and his number two took a sledgehammer to the door, dislodged the glass from where it was supposed to be before throwing the snowball. The order of operations was throw the snowball first, hit the door with the sledgehammer after. So it wasn't even our guy's fault, but that's the perception, right? So we have to go forward. So the story that we tell is even when it's not perfect, we can still make it better. And the innovation continues. So culture, number one, has a very high threshold for risk, right? It has a very high threshold for failure. The other thing it does is it makes a commitment to whatever the innovation is, it's going to make somebody else's life better. Number two, the essence is goodwill. And the goodwill often comes secondary to the potential profit margin. So even if we're doing incremental innovation, we're just doing small changes to a product, new and improved Tide, hypoallergenic Tide, Tide in cold water, Tide in hot water, Tide with lavender, Tide with whatever. But we are making the decision that it's going to be making somebody else's life better. That's number two. And number three, right? I mean, innovation doesn't exist unless the market says yes. So are we telling a story to the market that they get it, that they understand it, that it's worthwhile? I can't tell you how many innovations I hear of that say it was ahead of its time. It was ahead of its time. The market wasn't ready yet. That is entirely possible. I'd beg of that innovator to say, were you telling the right story?
Yeah. Gosh, Susan, it's so funny because you are one of the most interesting people I've ever met, and yet you still surprise me. So I love that you just sling in there the story about supporting those poker players. And, it just, well, you're telling stories, right? And it just brings everything that you're sharing to life. And I love the story of the snowball, and that's great. I want to switch gears a little bit right now because I'm dying to know, when you look back at 2020 and 2021, what do you think some of our biggest lessons have been, or some of your biggest lessons have been, or perhaps those of your clients?
Hey, it's Susan here. Like what you're hearing so far? Make sure you never miss an episode by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. So thank you for being here. Whether it's your first time or you're 10 episodes deep, if you want to learn more about me and the work that I do with innovation leaders, head over to susanlindner.com for more information. I'm always open to a conversation to learn how I might better support you. But for right now, let's get back to the show.
It's been a rough road, right?
Yep. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there's anyone who would look at it any differently. Even if you're Jeff Bezos and you got to launch yourself into outer space during COVID, and even if your stock has quadrupled in that time, there's no way this hasn't been challenging. I think there are very few people in the United States who don't know someone who has suffered gravely from COVID. And so I think 2020 was the disruption year. It was a year of us not knowing and living in a lot of fear. 2020. 2021 was us settling into the discomfort of the pandemic and saying, wow, this is the new reality. And we started getting a handle on how to handle ourselves. And as a result, being able to handle our families and our friends and our relationships, of going outside again, of online dating, or of figuring out whether or not we would go back to the office, or how would we manage our kids over Zoom. We started getting things down, if not to a science, then a bit of an art. I think 2021 is going to produce the greatest stories of resilience that the country hasn't seen, or maybe that the world hasn't seen, since the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the time when some of the greatest companies in our history were formed, where the Fortune 500 really took its hold, where we began to see companies who were giving and getting from those very tough times. And not just profiting, but really going through those other cycles of tolerating failure, trying hard again, and creating goodwill for the world, and then creating something that the market really needed. But as humans, as individuals, it's how we deal with pain that generates the story. Like, if a volcano erupts, that's a fascinating geological story. And there's a human story as the lava's cascading down the volcano. But what happens to the villagers and the stories of resilience of surviving that explosion are probably why we go back to Pompeii year after year, of understanding the destruction, the resurrection, the resilience of the people there, right? That's what we see. It's why we tell a 9/11 story, not just to commemorate those who have passed, but it's the rising. And so I'm really eager to hear from all of my listeners about what are the stories of the rising that are coming forward. Where do you see your kids changing and grappling with the pandemic, but getting stronger maybe, or finding new sides of their personality? The great walkout, right? What are they calling it? Of
The
people,
employee exodus.
yeah, of people leaving their jobs. I think this is going to be the greatest single impetus for entrepreneurship in our history, more so than the waves of immigrants coming to the United States and starting their businesses. I think people are leaving their corporate jobs, but they are starting their own thing. They're figuring out new ways of redefining themselves. And so it's a whole redefinition taking place. And I'm excited to hear all of the stories that are going to come out of 2021 as we launch into 2022. I know JP Morgan just said our economy will be back on track in 2022 as if, the great crystal ball. Let's hope so. Let's hope Jamie Dimon's right. That said, I feel like a lot of us are still in preparing mode. But I think I want to encourage my listeners to just stop as we are at the end of the year and take a look back and pat yourself on the back for how far you've come. And also look at the ways that you've innovated your own life, how you've changed it, how your work from home life has changed. So many people out there haven't even met their coworkers over the last 2 years, brand new teams. I know people who have left 2 jobs in the course of the pandemic, never met a single coworker.
Yeah.
Pretty impressive. So the resilience of the human spirit, even just to do something that we thought wasn't even possible 2 years ago, is pretty incredible. That's what Darwin always told us. It wasn't survival of the fittest. It was survival of those who could adapt and change with greatest ease and greatest speed. And that's really at the heart of innovation.
Yes. And there's the speed, the time element again. I'm self-aware enough to know that I'm annoyingly optimistic at times. So I really do believe that inside every challenge lies an opportunity. And so I think that that's what we've been seeing. I mean, I think back 10 years and how the company that I worked for at the time, they never would have dreamed of letting people work from home. And now it's like, well, we can do our jobs just as well from home. And the same with the exercise industry. Actually, you don't have to go to a gym and slog it out. There are apps, there's equipment that you can have in your home and you can get just as good a workout, arguably. So it's very interesting. And so I know you've been having lots of great conversations with innovation leaders and organizations. As you look ahead at 2022, maybe even 2023, what do you think will be some of the interesting trends, things to watch out for?
I was on a fascinating call yesterday with one of the top innovators at Microsoft who is looking at the whole work from home, virtual work, hybrid work, back to the office. And I was just blown away by the platforms that they're creating to figure out ways to really get 2 humans together in the best way possible. And one of those, he painted a scenario for us where now software is not just connecting, saying like, wow, I really need to meet up with the team when I need to be in Texas to see a customer and I need to meet people. How can I do that? So step 1 was finding an open office room in a Microsoft office nearby to where he was going to be. Any Microsoft office, right? So it's not even one he necessarily has to be affiliated with, but as a Microsoft employee of a particular strata, I guess I would say, he can go to any Microsoft office in the world and find an open meeting room to meet with someone. That was step 1. The next is, he had 2 team members who lived there. And although they've been working virtually, they happen to be in Texas. And so that interface where he finds his meeting room at Microsoft now connects to Yelp and says, I would like to take my team out and I would like to find a local restaurant nearby that I can plan during the course of my day. And I can look at both of their availabilities in a calendar and I can meet them at an open air cafe that is still in compliance with Microsoft rules about how people need to meet outdoors. And I can take those guys out for lunch. And then in addition to that, I can go one step further and I can create a conference call that I can put on either in my car or in a Microsoft setting. And I can meet 6 other customers around the world all in one Zoom. And so that's taking place through one interface. I can do calendaring, directions, Yelp. I can send flowers to my customers or whatever they may need, all through one interface. So that hybrid work feels like I'm traveling, I'm in person, I'm in the office, I'm in my car, I'm at my house, and it feels seamless to the experience of working together. And as more and more companies decide to give up their real estate, he was mentioning to us that REI, one of the biggest outdoor products companies like hiking and fishing and that kind of outdoors, were very dedicated to having an entire headquarters. And they decided to scrap the whole project because they saw the future of work was not in the office, especially for an outdoors company. And although they had built the most phenomenal campus with ropes and mountain climbing equipment and ponds that you could fish in and all this other amazing stuff, they decided that it wasn't about what they could provide to the employee, but rather what the employee needed for themselves. And develop an entirely new way of thinking about work that started with employee centricity and their needs. And I thought, wow, in my mind, what registered immediately was this is also an understanding of how women work. The 40-hour work week was designed with the implicit knowledge that somebody was at home caring for the kids, that it wasn't about how women work. It was about men going off to work, women staying home and doing X. And ever since the paradigm shifting of women going into the office, everything has been about, oh, work-life balance and making things flexible and what have you. But the burden was always on women to figure it out. And to now say, this isn't really for us to decide. It's for our workforce to decide how they need to and want to work in order to get their job done. Then the day of the week doesn't matter. The hour of the day doesn't matter. It's all about creating employee-centric models that serve the good of the work. But if we don't serve the employee, they will be out. And I can't tell you how many girlfriends I have who have said, I'm debating between two jobs. One of them says I will have to go back to the office at some point, and one says I won't. And the second job is always the one selected.
Yep.
I want it on my terms.
Yes. Gosh, that's so huge. Yeah, it's interesting because I think back to when we thought having ping pong tables at work and sleep pods was the coolest thing. But actually, what was that really doing? And so I love that you talk about the shift that we've seen, and finally companies are getting it. We need to make it about the employees. And it's just a shame that I think it took so many people so long to catch on. And especially with regards to women, you know, I have so many friends who have been homeschooling kids and really struggling to continue running their businesses or keeping up at work. So it's definitely a conversation worth having. And as we look to the future, something we absolutely have to keep in mind. And, you know, I think that you've probably said this to me in the past, but all innovation really has to have people at its core. And just as storytelling does as well. And so I think that's such a great lesson for all of us. You know, whenever you're creating something new, you got to think about who it's for and make sure that you're really speaking their language and creating something that makes sense for their lives.
Mm. And I think it's hard to get sometimes, you know, for some of our innovator clients, I just got off a call with a woman who was saying to me that one of her students was a PhD candidate who's doing research. She's like, what I'm working on isn't interesting to anybody. It's so esoteric and tiny. And she was like, well, what's the research? She goes, well, I study these very tiny worms that live in the Arctic ice, and they are the bellwether as to whether or not the climate is changing at one pace or another. And she and my jaw dropped and went, like, that's a really important story. She's like, it's just worms and ice. Nobody cares. I'm like, except for the second half of the sentence, where we learn whether we live or die based on the little worms. And I was like, not to mention, it sounds like a fantastical dessert in the summertime with just a little mezcal poured on top. Way to go. Boom. Instant industry. So sometimes the stories as scientists, right? I mean, so many of the clients that we work with are so deep into real important work at the bench that we can't see the forest for the trees. But that's why the storytelling matters, is we need to keep taking the walk down the path. So what happens next? And then what happens? And so as we get into this future looking stuff, even if you are working on an innovation, that's not going to be done until 2030. I remember walking through Lockheed Martin and seeing satellites. And I said, when is this going to be done? And he said, 2050. And I said, how do you work on a project for the next 20 plus years? And there are people on this team who will never see it finished, right? There were scientists that were going to retire in the next 2 years. And so, or won't continue working on it. They may very well see it. And he said, there are pieces of this satellite that require materials that have not yet been invented. And I said, how do you build, plan, budget, and figure out how to make when the materials haven't been invented? He said, we have absolute faith that the chemists will come up with the polymer that will create the material that will make the handle that someone needs to hold on to by the time we get to that point and we need it, because we have faith in innovation that the materials will continue to evolve and they will be able to withstand sub-zero temperatures of outer space. We just don't have that know-how now, but we will, and we have faith that we will. And I thought, wow, that is the underlying motivation of innovation is faith. And I thought, for all of these scientists who are so rigorous and factual and what have you, but the underlying unknowing requires an incredible amount of faith. And so what a lesson for like 2022 moving forward is look back at the 2020 that we've had of how hard that was, the 2021 when we really started to figure it out, and the 2022 that's built on the faith that we're going to get to a place that's way better than we ever thought possible when we were suffering through it in 2020. So imagine that fully formed satellite at 2050 with materials that we can't even imagine yet.
Gosh, I can't even imagine that, but I loved what you said, that we just have faith. We just got to have faith. And, I think about the situation that we currently find ourselves in globally. And I'd mentioned your interesting background before. Your background has been in the public health sphere. Anything that you can say that might reassure us, or any insights you might have based on your past experiences that maybe we can grab a hold of as we move forward here?
It's kind of funny when I think back of being 24 years old and working in HIV prevention in Thailand, working in red light districts, working in brothels, working with very rural farmers and hill tribe villages of indigenous people to Thailand. And what a mixture of populations to work with, what a mixture of belief systems around health. And it struck me being in this time now of realizing how much of our perception of health information is colored by our own unique lenses about how we feel about our bodies and our health. The things that we decide to believe. We don't know why chicken soup works, but it works when we have a cold, right? Maybe it's mom bringing it to us and she cares about us. Maybe there's some incredible, I'm sure scientists have done the research on what it is that's in that GD chicken soup that actually acts as some kind of healing elixir. But we have a million reasons to believe that chicken soup solves a cold really the world over. There's so many different kinds of chicken soup, but it's amazing how all over the world, that's the cure for the cold. So we come with these lenses about how we are cured, how we are soothed. And when the AIDS crisis hit, it was no different. And I thought, I would hear things like, oh, I don't need to wear a condom. I would hear from Thai men don't box with gloves. That's what I heard. And thanks to their kickboxing tradition in Thailand. But I never thought that when another health crisis came around again, I'd be hearing similar iterations about being either vaccine hesitant or mask hesitant or all different kinds of responses to the pandemic. Science be damned, right? Results and research be damned. And my last job before working in innovation storytelling was at the Centers for Disease Control, looking at all the different strains of HIV that were coming into the United States, some of which had drug resistance built into them because the drugs were really hard to take and had terrible, terrible side effects. And the other was just the rapidly changing strains of HIV. And if you think it's tough we're at Omicron now, and I know a year from now we're going to listen to this recording and laugh, but we were in the double letters of the English alphabet. We had already since left the Greek alphabet. So viruses are like people, they just keep changing and mutating and moving and stuff. So I think the lesson learned is, number one, we come to the table with a lot of compassion when we hear people's resistance, because none of us want to change our health behaviors. Wouldn't it be great if we could eat whatever we want, smoke whatever we want, drink whatever we want, and have no consequence? We always want things to be at status quo. That's lesson one. And I think for a lot of innovators, they feel the same way. Can't we just go on with the quarterly work that we're doing? Profits are great. Why do we need to keep changing and innovating? Yuck. Right. So we want to keep things at status quo. We want to do what we want to do. So we just know that going in as public health professionals and as innovators, change is terrifying. And it creates a whole lot of cortisol in the body, by the way. It's not just happening independently in our thinking. It's happening physically in our body. It creates stress. Right. So the other thing I learned is that regardless of the innovation that we're bringing in, a vaccine, a pill, a mask, even social distancing, a behavior, that there's instantly going to be resistance to it. But what's most important is the story that we tell. And we have to understand the preconceived stories that have already been circulating before we got there. So a lesson for other innovators is, what's the story that's been told before I roll out this story? What's, for lack of a better term, the garbage or the supporting details that I can leverage in order to make my story move? So you've already done X, Y, Z so brilliantly. I need you to do one tiny thing more that's going to make you exponentially safer. That's really helpful. And it's hard for newbies now in the midst of COVID to introduce this new vaccine, because we're like, what is that? Terrifying. It will magnetize my body. There'll be microchips floating through my body. I'm going to be tracked by the CIA, right? All these kinds of things that proliferate. With a new thing, it's hard. When I was working in Thailand on HIV, I had an innovation that was 10,000 years old, the condom. People had lots of preconceived notions about that. People had lots of beliefs around that one little rubber bag. We used to call it the balloon, right? So much associated with that one little thing. And so it's really important for innovators to find out what's the lore that surrounds that new thing you'll be introducing, even if it's never existed before. What came just before it that's going to cloud people's interpretation about what you're going to speak about. And then the last is, and this is true for every innovator, is, can you paint a picture of what the future will be like in the event that we adopt your innovation? Tell me how my life will be better, different, improved, not just the consequence. I saw so many posters in Thailand that said, get AIDS and die, right? That's where we were. 1 in 6 sexually active people were HIV positive where I lived at the time. There were 3 AIDS funerals a day where I lived. It was everywhere. So the fear was real. And you'd think that 800,000 people dead in America would be a wake up, right? But people still have their conceptions, and it's important to address them. Otherwise, the message won't get through. So it's kind of like you got to get out the snowplow and clear things, or at least embrace them and make a snowman out of them and say, we're going to add this on. Otherwise, the message doesn't move or doesn't land the way you'd hoped it would.
Gosh, Susan, I could hear you talk about this stuff forever, which is why I was so excited to interview you, because you have given us so much enlightenment today, and just so much wisdom and stuff to think about as we move into 2022. And certainly if you're listening to this later on in 2022, or maybe even 2023, stuff to think about as we look to the future. So thank you so, so much. Anything else that you want to leave us with before we wrap this today?
I think this faith element's really important as we get to the end of the year. It's the don't stop believing that whatever innovation it is that you're working on in the moment, know that it's valuable and it's important and the world needs it. And the story that you decide to tell that accompanies that innovation is probably one of the most important ones you will tell. And so know that, number one, give it a try. Try out your story. Try it out on a group of folks you think will be early adopters, and maybe a couple of skeptics who can help you figure out whether or not there are holes in the story, stuff people want to know more about, stuff that's really unclear. And then once you've gotten that group on board that says, yes, that's really important, I want to help tell that story. Now think about asking them to personalize that story. What's the story about why it's meaningful to them? And this is the lesson of all the prophets before us, right? There's a reason why the stories of our religious faiths keep circulating around the planet as they do, is because we've taken the stories of the prophets and we've made them our own. We can personalize them and we can tell them to our kids, or we can tell them to somebody else who may not be a believer, or we may share it with someone who is a believer. And it doesn't matter what faith you are of, or no faith at all. But the ability for someone to hear your story, to understand it, and to say, let me tell you why it matters to me, that becomes a viral innovation story. When someone can hear a story about your stuff and make it their own. And so that's the story. That's what I would encourage everyone at the end of this year, is to look back on the innovations they've been working on. Please don't stop telling your story, and let other people, when you start hearing your story repeated to other people, that's when you know you've won.
Amazing. Susan, thank you so much. We've got to do this again. This was great.
Yeah, this was so much fun, Nikki. Thank you. Alrighty, well, we are wrapping it up for 2021. Hard to believe. Thank you so much to everyone listening on Innovation Storytellers. If you have other friends and guests that you think would be fantastic for our show, please don't hesitate to invite them. We are grateful for your subscription to Innovation Storytellers. Thanks, everyone.
Now you might be asking, Susan, why innovation storytelling? Well, the truth is that an innovation story told well not only breaks down communication barriers so you can drive change and new growth, but it also helps other people remember and champion your work. And it propels your best ideas forward faster to secure you the runway, resources, and recognition you so richly deserve. In other words, stories are memory-making devices that significantly reduce the time it takes for you and your innovation to be understood. But like many leaders, you probably never got the memo that storytelling skills would be central to your success. Well, I've got some good news for you. It's not too late because I've got you covered. Whether you need an expert to come and speak to your innovation leaders, you need training in the art and method of innovation storytelling, or you just need the support and guidance of a consultant who can get you where you want to go in less time, visit www.susanlindner.com today to learn more and to set up a call to discuss your needs. I'm so looking forward to connecting with you and to helping you tell a great innovation story. If you like what you heard so far, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another episode. And leave us a comment. Tell us what you think of this episode. We'd love to hear from you. And if you didn't like what you've heard, just forget everything I've said.